The mist comes up off the paddies the way it always has, thin as breath, curling over water that shouldn't be there and yet has been there every autumn for 30 years. She stands at the edge of the dike in rubber boots gone soft with age, watching the visiting writer set up his tripod in the low gray light, and she almost smiles at how he keeps glancing at the water like it might do something unexpected. "You said on the phone this used to be a pasture," he says, breath fogging. "Worst one on the place," she says. "Rocky, low, useless. My grandfather used to say you could break a plow blade just walking across it." The writer crouches, camera clicking, catching the way the flooded rows run in careful rectangles toward the tree line, diked and deliberate, nothing like the wild swamp such a place ought to be. Beyond the far edge of the field, half swallowed in morning shadow, the old Quarry hillside still rises gray and terraced, quieter now than it once was, its conveyor belts rusted still. And this is all cranberries? Cranberries and rice, once. Just cranberries now, mostly. But it started because of that hill. She nods toward the quarry without quite looking at it, the way you might nod toward an old wound. They used to run their wash water right through a culvert onto this exact ground, flooded it something awful. Everybody in town thought it was the end of him. The writer straightens, sensing the shape of a story worth more than a caption under a photograph. Your grandfather. My grandfather, she says it simply, the way she has said it 100 times to herself, walking these same dikes alone in the early hours, checking water levels out of habit, long after there was any real reason for her to be the one doing it. Everybody expected him to sell. The quarry manager sure did. Instead, he did the opposite of what any sane man would have done with a flooded field. Steam lifts off the water in long ribbons as the sun edges over the tree line, turning the paddies the color of old copper. Somewhere out past the dike, a heron lifts off, unbothered, like it has done this every dawn for longer than either of them has been alive. He flooded it worse, she says, on purpose, built it up instead of fighting it. And by the time the leaves turned that first fall, he had something growing out here that nobody in 3 counties could match. She glances at the writer, gauging whether he understands yet what kind of story this is going to be. I was 14 that summer. I helped him build half these dikes myself, out here in the mud, while half the town laughed at us from the feed store parking lot. The writer lowers his camera slowly. I'd like to hear all of it. From the beginning, if you don't mind. She looks out over the water, at the mist still rising, at the quarry hill going gold in the early light, and for a moment she is not a grown woman in rubber boots, but a girl again, watching her grandfather stand ankle-deep in ruined pasture, unbothered by the water climbing his boots. It started, she says, with a letter from the quarry, and a culvert nobody thought twice about. That pasture had never been good for much of anything, not in all the years she could remember, and not for years before that either. 4 acres of low, rock-studded ground, tucked against the base of the quarry hill, where the topsoil ran thin over shale, and the spring runoff pooled in the same stubborn low spots every year. He kept a few head of cattle off it in the wet months, and let it lie fallow the rest of the time, because that was all it was good for. Fence posts leaned. A single dead cottonwood stood at the far corner, like a gray flag nobody had bothered to take down. It was the kind of field a man inherited and never quite gave up on, not because it earned its keep, but because giving it up felt like giving up on something older than the field itself. The quarry had been chewing into that hillside for longer than she'd been alive, a slow gray wound spreading a little wider every year, trucks grinding up the access road from dawn till dusk. Nobody in town thought much about it. It brought jobs, brought money through the diner and the feed store, and it kept its distance from the houses that mattered. The manager came out on a Tuesday in early spring, driving a company truck so clean it looked wrong, parked next to the old man's pickup. He wore a collared shirt tucked into pressed jeans, and he smiled the whole time he talked, the kind of smile that never quite reached past his teeth. He walked the fence line with a folder under his arm, gesturing at the rocky ground like he was doing the old man a favor, just by looking at it. He said the quarry wanted to expand its tailings storage, needed more low ground to catch runoff and settle sediment, and this pasture, sorry as it was, would do just fine. He named a number. It wasn't insulting exactly, but it wasn't respectful either, the kind of figure a man offers when he expects to be talked up to, not down from. The old man listened without saying much, hands in his coat pockets, boots planted in the mud at the fence line, and when the manager finished, he only said he'd think on it. The manager left smiling anyway, certain of how these things usually went. Land like that, a man that age, alone since his wife passed, no real use for 4 acres of rock and standing water. It seemed a foregone conclusion to everyone but the man who owned it. That evening, from the porch, she watched her grandfather stand at the edge of that same field for a long time, saying nothing, looking not at the pasture but past it, up toward the quarry's culvert mouth where a thin trickle of gray water already ran down into the grass, waiting for spring to make it worse. My grandmother's china cabinet still sits in the hallway of that house, and I remember standing beside it the morning the phone rang before 6, back when a call that early meant something was wrong. It was a neighbor down the county road, his voice tight with the kind of excitement people get when trouble belongs to someone else. He said my grandfather ought to come look at his bottom field, that something had happened overnight, that it looked like the whole low end of the property had gone under. We drove down together in the truck, the heater barely working, fog still sitting low in the ditches, and there it was, water where there shouldn't have been water, spread out gray and shining across the whole 4 acres, lapping up against the fence posts, like the pasture had turned into something else while we slept. The culvert that used to trickle now ran wide and steady, a man-made river pouring straight down from the quarry's hillside, cutting a fresh channel through what used to be grass. He didn't say much. He walked the fence line slow, the way he always did, studying the water like it was a map he hadn't finished reading. I asked him what happened, and he said the quarry must have redirected their runoff, opened something up that used to be closed off, maybe widened the drain. He didn't sound angry. That was the strange part. Everyone else sounded angry for him. By noon, half the county seemed to know. Word moved through the feed store faster than weather. Men I'd never spoken to stopped by the fence just to look, shaking their heads, saying what a shame it was, saying the quarry had gone and done exactly what everybody figured they would, sooner or later. Somebody joked that the old man's pasture had finally found a use, as a lake. Somebody else said, maybe now he'd take that number the manager offered, since there wasn't much a flooded field was good for except drowning what little grass grew there in the first place. My grandfather didn't argue with any of it. He stood at the edge of that new water, with his hands in his coat pockets same as always, watching the surface ripple where the culvert dumped in, watching the way the water pooled deeper on one side than the other, following some old contour of the land only he seemed to notice. I remember him crouching down at one point, right at the water line, and running his fingers through the mud like he was checking for something, texture maybe, or grain, or just the give of the ground beneath. That evening he came inside and pulled a cardboard box down from the closet shelf, the one with the seed catalogs he'd been saving since fall, and started going through them page by page under the kitchen light, like a man looking for an answer he already half remembered. I still have that catalog somewhere, water-stained at the corner, the pages soft as cloth from being handled so much that autumn. But before he ever ordered anything, before the mailman brought that first package wrapped in brown paper and string, my grandfather went out to the pasture alone one morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. I know because I heard the truck door and looked out my window and saw him walking toward the water with his boots already soaked through by the time he reached the fence line. He told me later, though not that day, that he stood at the edge a long while before he stepped in. The water was cold enough to ache, he said, but he waded out anyway, slow, testing the ground with each step the way a man tests ice he isn't sure will hold. He walked the whole 4 acres like that, back and forth, feeling where the bottom rose and where it dropped, where the mud held firm under his boot, and where it swallowed his foot to the ankle. He wasn't thinking about the quarry that morning, or the manager's offer, or what the men at the feed store were saying about his swamp. He told me his mind had gone somewhere else entirely, years back, to paddies terraced into hillsides on the other side of the world, water standing still and green in squares carved out of nothing, men bent over rows with their trousers rolled to the knee, moving through flooded ground like it was the most natural thing on earth to grow something in water instead of despite it. He said he remembered thinking, back then, how strange it looked the first time he saw it, and how it stopped looking strange the longer he watched. The water wasn't the enemy of the crop. It was the crop's whole reason for living. It held the heat of the day into the night, drowned out the weeds that couldn't stand wet feet, gave the roots something steady to hold on to when the sky forgot to rain. Standing in his own flooded pasture, feeling the cold work up through his trousers, he said all of that came back to him at once, clear as if no time had passed. And instead of asking himself how to get the water out, he found himself asking a different question: how to keep it in, how to shape it, where a man might build a low wall of earth to hold it steady instead of letting it run off toward the creek like it wanted to. He didn't say any of this out loud to anyone that day. He just came back to the house with his trousers soaked to the thigh, sat down at the kitchen table without a word, and pulled that box of catalogs down off the shelf like a man hunting for a memory he needed to put a name to. My grandmother says she remembers the sound of that catalog before she remembers the words in it, the dry rasp of the pages turning under his thumb, over and over, like a man counting money he didn't have. He'd circled things before, over the years: seed corn, fence wire, a used harrow he never bought. But this was different. He sat at that table 2 nights running, the lamp burning low, and on the second night he finally stopped on a page near the back, one she says had gone soft and gray from handling, and set his finger down on a small block of type advertising cranberry starts, shipped bare root, hardy to Zone 4. She was 14 that fall, old enough to be trusted with a shovel, and young enough to still think her grandfather could do anything he set his mind to, even if she didn't understand why he'd set his mind to this. When the little bundle arrived by mail, wrapped in damp burlap and smelling of peat, she thought it looked more like something you'd find rotting in a ditch than something you'd pay good money to own. He didn't explain much. He never did, in those days, when it came to the war years or the things he'd seen that shaped how he looked at ordinary dirt. He only said that flooded ground wasn't ruined ground, that some plants wanted their feet wet the way a man wants his boots dry, and that they were going to build the field a set of walls. So they built walls, low ones, no higher than a man's shin, made of the same clay-heavy soil the quarry water had been softening for weeks, packed and tamped with the backs of shovels and the flat of a hoe until they held a shape. row after row, dividing that 4-acre pasture into a checkerboard of shallow pens, each one meant to hold its own foot of water like a held breath. Her hands blistered before the second day was done. Her arms ached in a way that woke her at night. And all the while her mother stood at the fence some evenings, arms crossed, saying it plainly enough for anyone to hear, that a 14-year-old girl had better things to do than wade through Quarry mud-building toy dams for an old man's foolishness. He never answered that in front of her. He'd only look at the girl, and then at the walls rising slow and crooked and stubborn out of the ruined pasture, and go back to packing mud with his hands like there wasn't a clock running on any of it. She remembers thinking, more than once that week, that maybe her mother was right, that maybe grief and old memories had finally gotten the better of a man who used to be the most sensible person she knew. But she kept shoveling anyway, because he asked her to, and because some quiet part of her wanted to see what he saw. Word of the dikes reached town before the mud had even dried on her boots. She remembers her grandfather driving into the feed store that Thursday for wire and nails, and how the talk stopped when the bell over the door rang, the way it does in a small place when everyone already knows what they're about to say and just needs the target to walk in first. The loudmouth was there, as he always was, leaning against the counter with a coffee cup he never seemed to drink from, and he didn't wait long. "Hear you're building yourself a rice paddy out there, old man," he said, loud enough for the back of the store to hear. "County's finally gonna condemn that land for you. Save the quarry the trouble." The other men laughed the way men laugh when they want credit for being the funniest one in the room. Someone called it the old man's swamp, and the name caught like a burr on wool, repeated at the counter, repeated over coffee at the diner, repeated across fence lines until it wasn't even meant as an insult anymore, just the field's new name. Farmers who'd never once driven past that pasture started asking after the swamp, like it was a local attraction, a joke everybody was already in on. A man selling seed corn near the register said he'd give it till Christmas before the bank had papers drawn up. Another wagered a case of beer that the girl would quit hauling mud before the frost did. Her grandfather stood at the counter through all of it, paid for his nails, and said nothing but oblige to the clerk. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't so much as glance toward the men by the stove. She wasn't there to see it herself, she only heard it second-hand, from a cousin who worked the register and told her mother, who told her without meaning her to hear, though she did anyway, sitting on the stairs with her sore hands wrapped around a mug of something gone cold. She remembers how the words sat in her chest that night, heavier than the mud had been, not because they were cruel exactly. Men like that weren't cruel so much as small, comfortable in their smallness, but because some frightened part of her believed they might be right. She thought of the checkerboard of low mud walls out past the fence, crooked and half-finished, water already pooling brown and cold in some of the pens from the quarry's steady bleed. It looked, she had to admit, exactly like something a desperate old man would build. Not a farm, a folly. She almost said so to him the next morning, standing at the edge of the field with a shovel in her hands and the cold coming up through her boots. But he was already down in the mud, patient as ever, pressing another course of earth into place with his palms, and something about the set of his jaw kept the words in her throat. So she picked up the shovel and worked instead of speaking, and that became the shape of the weeks that followed. She tells the writer now, walking the paddy edge with her hands in her coat pockets, that there was no single moment of belief. Belief came the way water comes to a low field, not all at once, but by degrees, filling in behind you while you're busy doing something else. They planted the rice starts first, kneeling in the shallow diked pens with the cold water numbing their fingers past feeling, pressing each slender green shoot into the silty bottom, the way he'd shown her, spaced by hand-widths he counted under his breath like a man saying a rosary. He didn't explain the counting, he rarely explained anything twice, but she noticed he never rushed, never let a bent shoot stand crooked, never let her leave a gap in a dike unpacked at day's end, no matter how tired her arms were or how the dinner bell rang twice from the house before either of them moved. The cranberry starts came by mail a week later, wrapped in damp paper inside a box that smelled of cedar and cold earth, and he handled them like something alive that could still be lost through carelessness. They went into the boggier plots along the field's low seam, where the quarry's water pooled deepest and stayed longest, and he showed her how to firm the peat around each root without crushing it, his big scarred hands surprisingly gentle for a man who could still swing a fence post like it weighed nothing. At school, the gossip found her anyway, the way it always does in a town small enough that everyone's business travels faster than the mail. A boy in her class asked if her grandfather was building a swimming pool for his cows. A teacher, meaning kindness, asked careful questions about how things were at home, her voice pitched the way people speak to someone they suspect is in trouble. She answered plainly and did not cry, though some nights she wanted to, not from the mockery itself, but from the loneliness of being the only one who saw him every morning before light, boots already muddy, moving down the rows like the work was a kind of prayer he couldn't stop saying. She kept going out to the field anyway, not because she was certain anymore that he was right. Certainty came later, with the frost and the first green shoots pushing up stubborn through cold water, but because loyalty, she says now, running her thumb along a dry vine at the paddy's edge, doesn't wait for proof. It just shows up in boots every morning, whether the mud makes sense yet or not. The storm came in July, the way summer storms do in that country, without much warning beyond a green tint to the evening sky and a stillness in the air that made the dogs restless. She remembers the radio crackling out a warning between songs, the announcer's voice flat and routine, as if he'd said the same words 100 times that season. Her grandfather heard it differently. He was up from his chair before the second mention of heavy rainfall totals, already pulling on his boots, already moving toward the door with that quiet urgency she'd only seen in him a few times. Not panic, never panic, but a kind of readiness that seemed to come from somewhere older than the moment itself. They worked through the night. The quarry's runoff, already swollen from weeks of routine dumping, surged with the storm's first hour of rain until the culvert roared like something alive, spilling brown water fast enough to eat at the dike edges they'd built so carefully in the spring. He handed her a shovel without a word and took up his own, and they moved along the berms by flashlight and then by nothing at all when the batteries gave out, working by feel and memory, packing mud and stone into the places where the water pressed hardest. She says now that she understood, in those hours, something about him she hadn't before, not through anything he said, because he said almost nothing, only short instructions delivered in a voice stripped down to its function, but through the way his hands moved. Steady, unhurried even when the water rose past their ankles and then their knees. He would pause every so often, listening to the sound of the culvert, reading the water the way another man might read a gauge, and then direct her to the next weak point before she'd even seen it herself. It was, she realizes only in hindsight, a soldier's economy of motion, discipline worn so deep into him that it surfaced without calling attention to itself, without explanation, the way a man breathes. Somewhere near 3 in the morning the rain slackened, then stopped, leaving behind a silence broken only by the water still moving through the paddies, contained now within the dikes they'd shored, dark and quiet under a sky beginning to clear. He stood at the edge of the closest plot for a long moment, and she remembers thinking he looked less like a farmer checking his field and more like a man conducting some private inspection, satisfied that a line had held. He didn't smile. He never smiled at moments like that. But he put a hand briefly on her shoulder, and in that gesture, wordless and brief, she understood that the night had mattered, not just to the crop, but to something else he was measuring that she wouldn't fully understand for years. By late summer, the field had stopped looking like a wound and started looking like something almost holy. She remembers the morning she first noticed it clearly, not the slow accumulation of days she'd half-watched while doing chores, but a single moment when the light came low across the pasture and she saw, really saw, the green stalks of rice standing in orderly rows above the standing water, swaying faintly, and beneath them, at the paddy's flooded edges where the cranberry starts had taken hold, a blush of red beginning to creep across the vines like something waking up after a long sleep. The quarry's water, the same water that was supposed to have drowned them out, sat calm and glassy between the dikes, holding the reflection of the sky, and it was, she thought, the strangest kind of beautiful, a swamp that had been shamed into becoming a garden. Word moved through the county the way it always did, slow at first and then all at once, and the same men who'd once slowed their trucks to laugh now slowed them to stare. Neighbors who'd never once turned down the gravel lane found reasons to drive past, windows cracked, saying nothing, just looking, the way people look at something they can't yet explain to themselves. She remembers a woman from the church stopping her car right in the road, stepping halfway out just to see the color of the cranberries catching the evening sun, and driving off again without a word, as if she'd witnessed something she wasn't sure she was allowed to comment on yet. Even the quarry manager came, though he didn't announce himself as anything more than a man checking on drainage. He stood at the fence line one afternoon in his creased trousers and clean boots, hands in his pockets, looking out over water he had ordered dumped there to ruin a stubborn old man, and for the first time since this had all begun, he didn't speak first. He watched the rice bend in the wind. He watched the red deepen among the green leaves, and when the old man walked over, wordless, wiping his hands on a rag, the manager only nodded once, the kind of nod men give when they've run out of things to threaten someone with, and turned back toward his truck without another word about buying the land. She stood at the fence that day beside her grandfather, feeling something shift in the air that had nothing to do with weather, a quiet turning, as though the whole valley was recalculating something it had assumed it already understood. He didn't gloat. He never did. He only looked out at the paddies a while longer, the way a man looks at a wound finally starting to heal, and said it was almost time to start watching the water for something else now. Not danger this time, but readiness. Readiness came, as he'd known it would, in the first cold snap of October, when the leaves along the fence rows turned the same rust color as the berries floating thick beneath the paddy water. She remembered the morning he woke her before dawn, no explanation needed anymore, because by then she understood the rhythm of the place better than she understood most things in her own life. They flooded the cranberry beds higher, just as he'd shown her months before, and the berries rose to the surface in drifts, so dense the water itself seemed to blush red, an ocean of small floating lanterns catching the weak autumn sun. They worked with rakes and low wooden corrals, herding the berries toward the collection nets, the way another man might herd cattle, and her grandfather moved through the water with a steadiness that made the cold and the ache in his knees seem like small, distant things. The rice came in beside it, heavier than either of them had dared hope, gold heads bowing low enough to brush the water, and they cut and bundled it the old slow way, by hand, because he trusted his hands more than any machine the county could lend him. Neighbors, who hadn't set foot near the fence line all summer, suddenly found reasons to drive the back road slow, craning their necks at the sight of two full harvests rising from a field they'd once called ruined. Word moved the way it always did in that town, through the feed store, through church parking lots, through phone lines strung along fence posts, and by the second week, a stranger's car she didn't recognize came bumping up the gravel drive, dust trailing behind it like a small storm. The man who stepped out introduced himself plainly, said he represented a grain and produce co-op 2 states over, said he'd heard rumors he hadn't quite believed until he stood at the edge of the paddies himself. He walked the dikes with her grandfather for the better part of an hour, asking questions about water depth and berry variety and rice strain, nodding slower and slower as the answers came, until finally he took a folded paper from his jacket and laid out terms right there on the tailgate of the truck. A standing contract, he called it, for everything the land could produce, cranberries and rice both, year after year, at a price no one at the feed store would have believed if she'd said it aloud. Her grandfather read every line twice before he signed it, the way he did with anything that mattered, and when he finally set the pen down, he looked out at the water one more time, quiet, like a man closing a long chapter he wasn't quite ready to admit was ending yet. The ink on that contract wasn't even dry a full season before the state came knocking on a different door. She remembers her grandfather telling it later with something close to a smile, though he wasn't a man who smiled easy. The county had passed new runoff rules that spring, tighter than anything the Quarry had dealt with before, and a state inspector with a clipboard and a stern manner walked the same drainage culvert that had once poured gray water onto the pasture, tracing it back to its source with the kind of patience nobody at the Quarry expected. He measured sediment, tested water, wrote it all down, and what he found had a number attached to it, and the number had fines attached to it, and the fines kept climbing the longer the Quarry kept doing what it had always done. The manager who'd once stood at the fence line, arms crossed, waiting for a stubborn old man to fold, found himself instead sitting across a table from that same old man, hat in hand, in a way he never would have imagined a year before. There was no shouting this time, no threats about progress or property values, just quiet talk about culverts and easements and what it would cost to keep running that water the way they'd always run it, versus what it would cost to stop. Her grandfather listened more than he spoke, the way he always did. He didn't gloat, didn't remind the man of anything he'd said back at the start. He just laid out what he needed, formal water rights, paid fair, spelled out on paper, so the flow that fed his paddies couldn't be shut off on a manager's whim ever again. It wasn't revenge he was after, it was permanence. The papers were drawn up within the month. The Quarry paid him for the right to keep sending that water down onto his land, the very water they'd once hoped would drown him out. She still finds something almost funny in that, walking the paddy edge now with the visiting writer beside her, notebook open, pen moving fast to keep up. The Quarry's punishment had become his lifeline, and now it was his by law, in ink, with a state seal pressed into the corner of the page. Her grandfather kept that paper in the same drawer as his discharge papers, she tells the writer, like they belonged together somehow. 2 documents from 2 different kinds of service. 2 things he'd never once bragged about, but never let anyone take from him either. That November, she says, the roadside stand went up like it always did. Plywood on sawhorses, a hand-painted sign, baskets of dark red berries, still damp from the bog. and the first truck that pulled off the county road that Thanksgiving week belonged to the loudest man from the feed store, the one who used to call the paddies a swamp, loud enough for the whole counter to hear him. He didn't say much that morning. He climbed down, boots crunching gravel, and stood there a moment looking at the baskets like he was doing arithmetic in his head. Then he bought 4 pounds and didn't haggle over the price. Behind him came 2 more from the same bench of regulars, then a woman from the diner who'd laughed along with them more than once, then the auction man who used to needle him about drowned dirt. Nobody made a joke that day. They paid. They nodded. Some of them lingered a little too long trying to find something to say that wasn't quite an apology, and he let them off easy every time, same as he always did. He never needed the apology. He only ever needed the water, and by then he had that in writing. She tells the writer all this standing at the edge of the nearest paddy, the fall flood already shin-deep across the diked squares, cranberries floating loose on the surface in drifting red rafts, the way they do right before harvest. The Quarry hillside still rises behind the tree line, quieter now than it used to be, its washwater still running down the same culvert, still filling the same low pasture her grandfather once stood in wearing his old field jacket, while men laughed from a truck bed. The dikes are the same ones they built that first September, patched and rebuilt 100 times since, but never abandoned. She flooded it herself this year, same weeks in fall, same slow release of water across the same stubborn rocky ground, exactly as he taught her, kneeling beside her with his careful hands, showing her where to pack the mud tight. The writer asks if she ever thinks about selling, now that the land's proven and the offers must come sometimes. She looks out at the water holding the whole low field like a mirror, cranberries drifting red across it, and shakes her head slow. Some things you don't sell, she says. Some things you keep flooded on purpose, every single year, because a man who knew what not to leave behind taught you that patience holds more than pride ever will. Then she bends down, cups a handful of the cold water, and lets it run back through her fingers into the paddy, the way he used to.